Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Lamed Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Aviva Appelman in loving memory of Florence Appelman on her first year at site that was yesterday. May her neshama have an aliyah. Okay, before we start, I want to remind everybody, or I don't know if you saw, hopefully you saw, but I haven't mentioned it in class, but now I will. Starting next week on November 10th on Sundays, for the next 3 Sundays, we'll be having part 3 of the Complete Beginner's Guide to Gemara with Rabbanit Sarna. So the topic this time is going to be how the logic works, dealing with the inner logics of the Gemara and the different terms used for different logics. And, there'll be a lot more than just that, but that will be the gist of the focus of it. And it's just the next part in the series of getting the basic concepts behind how the Gemara works. So if you haven't yet registered, the course is free, but registration is required. And you can find it right on the homepage of our website. If you don't see it there, it'll be, if you're listening to this sometime later and it's no longer there, then you can the course is a Zoom class, 3 Sundays, and it's always available digitally after. So it's always available on our course, the course section of our website. So just look for courses and you'll see it there. There's also another course coming up in January with Gila Fine, who came out with a book recently, about Agadot, particularly this book is about women, different Agadot about women, and it's going to be, as all our classes are usually focused on methodology, it's going to be a methodology course on how to analyze Talmudic stories, using one of the examples of one of the characters she discusses in the book, and it'll be a Chavruta-based class. Leah's class is more a lecture. This one will be a Chavruta-based class, and that will be coming up in January. So we have a lot of interesting things coming up. And please register for the courses. Okay, we are now going to start our daf. So our daf, I will warn you, is a little bit complicated. There's a lot of back and forth. It gets a little confusing what we're up to and where we are. And there's, as usual, a lot of different interpretations because how this relates to other sugyot is not so clear and what the differentiations are. So I'll try to kind of go with one or two, more probably one approach while giving you kind of where the difficulties are in that approach, or just kind of mentioning that it's not the only way to answer this question. So take a deep breath before going into this daf, and here goes. By Rava, we're on the second line of our daf. Rava asked the following question: Bebari he'ach. What about a case where someone is not on their deathbed? Now, what is he talking about? Well, he continues to explain. Ki ka'amar Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka b'shchib me'ra debar orutehu aval bebari lo. He's relating to what Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka said. Remember, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka said, and we had 2 interpretations, but we'll just go with the one that he says. You can choose ben avanim if you want. Bilashon Yerusha, right? Bilashon matana again. Language of giving, you can give anything. By the way, I looked up. I wanted to say this in class the other day, but I wasn't sure that what I was saying was correct, so I didn't say anything. But I mentioned how the word matana and latet is the same root. So as I was saying it, I said it's not the same in English, but I did look it up. And give and gift are actually from the same root. So if you look up the etymology of the word gift, it comes from give. So there you have it. It's the same in Hebrew and English. Now, if you do something in the language of giving, in the language of a gift, it is for sure you can do anything you want, right? We learned that. You could give to anybody all of your property. And we'll get to exactly how that works in a few dapim. But we're now talking the Bilashon Yerusha, where Yerusha can only go to the person who is supposed to inherit you. But what if you give it to someone who's going to inherit you, but you prefer one over the other, and you say, instead of dividing it equally among all my children, all my sons, I'm going to give it only to one son. Or if you have no sons, you have daughters, you want to give it all to your daughters? Can you do that? Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka says yes. The rabbis say no. If you remember, his whole source was on the day that you give your nachala over to your children. And the question was, why did it say he gives his nachala over? Theoretically, it goes to them automatically. So it brought the father into the picture to teach you, according to Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, that he can decide if he wants to give some, right, all of it to one child and nothing to the other. Now that pasuk is relating to the day a person dies, at least the simple reading of that pasuk. On the day, remember the end of that sentence was, you can't give the firstborn you can't give someone the firstborn portion if they're not the firstborn, right? And this whole thing, bein ben banim, by the way, was only not regarding the firstborn portion. The firstborn portion, that double portion, for sure goes to the Bechor. But if you wanted to give the rest of your property to somebody else, you could, in the language of Yerusha even. That's what Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka says. So now, since the pasuk you learned it from is all talking about a person on their deathbed, presumably, because it's Vayabi Yom Chilop Anav, let's go back to the words now that I just read. Kika Amr, here are the two sides of the question. When Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka said, it was b'shchimera debaru, because that's when a shchimera can just say, I want to give, when you're on your deathbed, you can say, I want to give this to this one, this to this one, right? And we do whatever you say. It's called divrei shchimera kechtuvim uchim surim dami. It's as if they were written and given already. It was as if you did a kinyan, even though you didn't. So that works because that's the context of the pasuk, where he gets it from. Aval b'bari lo, but it wouldn't apply to a person who says it when they're healthy. Right? Like nowadays, people write wills often when they're healthy, not when they're on their deathbed. So, but that wouldn't apply. You wouldn't be able to, with the language of Yerusha, give it all to one over the other. Oh, Dilma afilu b'bari nami, or maybe right now you could tell me, but could be the day you decide to write a will. Okay, and the day you decide to divide up your property. It doesn't necessarily have to be the day of your death. So maybe Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka would apply as well, even if you're healthy. So now okay. So now the Gemara brings an answer of Rav Meshashia. It's going to get a little bit confusing, but I'll tell you already where we're going. He's going to bring up a discussion between Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi about the language in the Mishnah. And in the end, Rav Meshashia is going to end up kind of being right. And I'm sorry, Rabbi Natan is going to end up, like Rebbe's going to try to answer him, but then shift his answer and say, no, I was wrong in what I just said, which is going to mean that Rabbi Natan, what he says in the beginning is going to be true. And that's going to be Rav Meshashia's answer, okay? Because we're going to see that it's going to show that Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka applies even in the case of someone who's healthy. Where are we going to get this from? We need a little background. We're going to learn it from a ketuba benin dichrin. Okay, if you learn ketuba, you might remember this, you might not. It's a little confusing, so you might not remember all these details. Ketuba benin dichrin is there's all sorts of things that the husband promises to the wife in the ketuba. Now, a husband promises his wife, in the event of death or divorce, you will get 200 zuz if she's a virgin. She's not 100 zuz. If he often adds a tosefet, an additional amount, and the money she brings into the wedding for a dowry called the nichsei tzon barzel, also there's nichsei melog, but that's not considered the ketuba. The nichsei tzon barzel, the one she brings in, and he gives back at whatever they're valued at the time he dies, okay, or divorces her. So she brings in a dowry, so to speak, for the wedding, which her family gives her, and then she gets it back at whatever value they're at the time of the death or divorce. So all those three parts, the ketuba, the tosefet, and the dowry, this nichsei tzon barzel, she gets back all of that in the event that the husband dies. In the event that she dies, he inherits her ketuba, so she gets nothing. Well, this created a bit of a problem because a lot of fathers or families that were giving her a dowry didn't want to give her so much money because they said it's going to be lost from our family. It'll go to her, and if she dies first, the husband will inherit it all and we'll lose it. So what did they say? The rabbi said in order to encourage people to give larger dowries, they added a stipulation to the ketuba that says, in the event that the woman dies first and the husband inherits her property, when the husband dies, now what happens? Theoretically, it doesn't really leave her family because it goes to her children. But the husband might have remarried and had other children. The husband might have had two wives and had other children. The husband might have been married before he married her and had other children. So all of her property, what's the problem? Her dowry is going to get divided equally between all the sons of this person, which means they're going to lose out. So the ketuba benin dichrin is zachar. It's just very simple, male, because Dalet and Zayin switch in Aramaic. So it's the ketuba of the male children, which means that it's a stipulation in the ketuba that promises the wife that in the event that she dies first and the husband inherits all her property, all of her ketuba money that we discussed before will be divided only among her children that she has with him. That's a ketuba benin dichrin. So comes Now here comes the discussion, the braita. Rav Meshashia Amar le Rav Meshashia le Rava. To answer Rava's question, is it applied to a case of Abaye as well? Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka's approach. He says, let's learn from the following braita. Tashma, let's learn from here. De Amar lo Rabbi Natan le Rebbe. Rabbi Natan said to Rebbe. Rabbi Natan was Rabbi Natan the Babylonian. He was a Babylonian in the time of the Tanaim. That wasn't so common. He comes to Rabbi Yehuda, haNasi, who put together the Mishnah and starts questioning him about his Mishnah. He says, Shnitem Mishnatchem ke Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. Did you write your Mishnah like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka? Like you put a stam Mishnah in Ketubot that goes like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. And that was kind of a question. Now, the difficulty, not a question, but a difficulty. What? You put a Mishnah like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka? Why? Ditnan, because it says in the Mishnah, and here's the ketuba benin dichrin. Lo katavla. If you didn't write in your ketuba, the ketuba benin dichrin, okay, now let's see what that is, and which you already know because I told you. Benin dichrin, yahamalech minai, the banim scharim that you will have with me, the children we will have, the male children. Inun yirtun, they will inherit, notice the language here, language of inheritance. They will inherit kesef ktubatech yoter chulkehan de'imachuon. They will get your kesef ketuba more than the other brothers, meaning I won't give it at all to the other sons, only to those that are our joint children. Kesef ketubatech, chayav. Now, go back to the beginning. If you didn't write this in your ketuba, you anyway need to give it. Why? Shetnai beitinu. This is a t'nai beitin. This is something, and that we've learned before, if you didn't write a ketuba to a woman at all, she gets the basic ketuba stuff because it's something the court says you have to do. And if you don't do it, you're responsible to give the money anyway, even if you didn't write the ketuba. So even if you don't have a ketuba, you have the rights that the ketuba affords you. So now, what's the problem here? The problem is that this sounds like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. Why? And that bothers Rabbi Natan. He thinks the Mishnah should be according to everybody. Because it says these sons will inherit over other sons. That's a case of not ben abanim, but banim ben abanim, right? It's the same idea. The father is deciding with the language of inheritance, right? If it's gifted, of course he could do anything he wants. But the language put into the ketuba is a language of a Yerusha, of an inheritance, going to some children favoring some over others. That's Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. So Rabbi Natan says to Rabbi Yehuda haNasi, how'd you put your Mishnah? Just like only like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. Now it's not, Rebbe has a possible answer. If you remember, we saw in the previous daf that Rebbe said we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, and either we halacha is like him, we rule like him. Okay, we have that whole discussion about ruling halacha ma'aseh. He didn't say, but still, it wouldn't be so surprising. But I guess it bothered Rabbi Natan. Maybe he didn't agree with that. And instead of Rebbe saying yes, I hold like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, instead, Rebbe tries to answer the question. He changes the language in the Mishnah. Oh, no, the ketuba shouldn't say yartun, and the Mishnah shouldn't say that you put in the ketuba yartun, they'll inherit. No, it should be yispun. Lasev means to give, okay, to pass over onto them. So he says, change the language of the Mishnah. Okay, and with that, he resolves it, and therefore, he's trying to say it holds like the rabbis as well. However, just like we saw before that Rebbe admitted his mistake and changed his mind, we're going to see twice today somebody doing that. I'm a Rebbe, it's a great line. Yeldu taitabi. It was immaturity that got into me. And I was brazen enough to answer this answer in front of Rabbi Natan the Babylonian without thinking it through properly, because it's a wrong answer. There's no way you could have the ketuba in dichron with the language of Yispun for a side problem. Ela de Kaimalan, we know it to be a fact that a halacha, that benin dichrin lo tarfim mishabde, they cannot collect their ketuba, they can't go collect the ketuba money from lien property. Let's say the father leaves nothing, but he did sell land from after the time the ketuba was written. Now, if it was a gift, then that would mean that it was given to them already at the time it was written. Now, they're not alive, but we'll get back to that later. But it's as if it was in their possession at the time, and any of the ketuba money can be collected from the Chasim Shuabadim. But this element of the ketuba cannot be collected from lien property, which means, so if it was a gift, they should be able to collect it, because a gift applies at the moment, as opposed to Yerusha, which only kicks in at the time of death. So therefore, he takes back his response And he says, you're right, it must be Yershun, which means if it's Yershun, then it is only Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. Elashmamina Yertun Tnan, it must be, it's really Yershun. And Man Shamaledi Lehai Svara, who's the one who holds that Yershun works? Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, that you can choose some children over the other. It's him. And when is this being written? When is this being promised? At the time of the ketuba. He's not on his deathbed. So what do you learn here? Shmamina Afilu Bebari. Now, it would have been nice and easy if the sugya ended here. Okay? So it was a little complicated, but not too complicated yet. Okay? And the sugya ends, and basically we have an answer to our question. This Mishnah we saw from this braita, this Mishnah is clearly Rabbi Yehuda, is clearly Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, and it's in a case of bari, and there you have it. Yershun, you can choose certain sons over the other. It's only Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka's position, so there's your answer. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka said what he said, even in a case of bari. Comes Rav Pappa, and here comes a bit of a difficulty of understanding what exactly Rav Pappa is trying to do here. But we'll go with the simple way that he's not necessarily disagreeing with the resolution, like the answer to the question, but he's basically focusing on one line in this discussion. And what he's saying is, when Rebbe says Yispun Tnan in the middle there, before he then rescinds what he said, why did he need to say Yispun Tnan? Actually, he had a much better answer. If he wanted to say the whole thing was Chachamim, he could have said it much more easily. Okay, that's Rav Papa's question. And the Abaye is going to come back with a retort. It's going to start getting confusing because Abaye then is going to retract his retort. And then somebody will then try to answer why he retracted it and say, no, maybe you didn't need to retract it. We're going to have a lot of back and forth and try to remember what we're up to. It's always a little confusing. But that's going to be where it gets a little confusing. Rav Papa says to Abaye the following. Bein laman damar yispun, ubein laman damar yirtun. And whether you say yirtun or whether you say yispun, okay, now, before he gets to what he wants to, his point is, he's kind of raising a question, and then he's going to get to what his main point is. Wait a minute. A person cannot give something that's not yet in existence, and not only that, but to someone who's not yet in existence. Now, what's this ketuba? He's promising something to children that are not yet born. They're about to get married. They're not married yet. They don't have children. And afilu Rabbi Meir da Amar Adam Davar Shelo Ba'Olam. Now, Rabbi Meir does have this position that you can give something to someone that's not yet in existence, but that's ledavar hanemile ledavar sheyeshno ba'olam. You can give an item that's not yet in existence to a person that is in existence. But even Rabbi Meir, who is more lenient on this matter, aval ledavar she'eno ba'olam lo. But to someone who's not in this world, no way, no how. So how does human indifferent work in general? Okay, we're not yet up to what our point is for our purposes, but first he starts with this question. How does this work in general? Well, because the rabbis wanted to create this stipulation, because they had an ulterior motive or an agenda, you could say. Their agenda was to get fathers to give bigger dowries to their daughters. So to do that, they kind of overrode this halacha. Now, first of all, the rabbis always have the ability when it comes to money. We say hefker beitin hefker. They can move things from one person to the other. So they have the power to do that, even though halachically it doesn't exist. The rabbis have the power in a takana to do that. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, haNami t'nai beitin shane. We could say the same thing. Even if you're the rabbis and you say bein ben abanim doesn't work, giving one son over all the other sons and saying I'm giving with Yerusha, I'm being Yoresh to this son, all of my possessions to the exclusion of the others doesn't work. But for the purposes of the Tanai Beitin, yes, it would work. So comes Rav Papa and says, why did Rebbe need to answer Yispun Tnan to say, oh, it's right, again, before he then rejected it himself, Rebbe. But why did he need to answer that when he could have just said simply, oh, it's the rabbis, also the rabbi's position, because, right, by saying Yispun, he said it's also the rabbi's position, but he had a much simpler way of saying it's just a Tanai Beitin. And theoretically, that could have even, right, if you take Rav Papa all the way, theoretically, and some of the commentaries take it farther, to say we actually then have no answer, because this isn't just Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, this is everyone's position, and that leaves us with no answer, really. Okay? So, and some commentaries do say that that's the conclusion in the end of this sugya. But that's not so clear. Okay? So now, So now the question is, why did Rebbe have to say Yispun instead of Yirtun? To which the Gemara says, Amalei. Abaye explains what pushed Rebbe to change the language when he could have easily answered, oh, it's just it's not baked in, and even the rabbis agree with it because there's some other agenda going on here, and we override the typical halacha here, or it's a unique situation. No, well, what motivated him was mishum de kamapik la b'lashon yirtum. What bothered him, Rebbe, by wanting to change the language is because the language of Yirtun, Yerusha, sounds like the Mishnah went more like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. In other words, you could have done Ketubin and Dichrin and used the language of Yispun, and then it would have sounded more like, again, it's a little hard to explain this, and the commentaries have different ways, but it's sort of that the language itself sounds like, even if you say it's a T'nai Beitin, it still has the semblance of sounding like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, because you have Yerusha and you have a favoring of some over others, and it works anyway. That seems to be like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. So to counter what Rabbi Natan was saying, what he did like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, Rabbi tried to answer, oh no, you could just change the language and then it won't sound like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. However, again, we're going to have Abaye changing his mind about what he said. Hadran Abaye lav milti de amre. The truth is, it's not right what I just said. Ditnan, because it says in a Mishnah, lo katavlan. Okay, now, what he's basically saying is, I have a different explanation why Rebbe really didn't need to have changed the language. Because even with Yershun, and even if you don't say the Tanai Beitin, the language of Yerusha here is not going to bother us. What was he saying before? The language of Yerusha was going to bother Rabbi Natan the Babylonian because it sounded like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. Now he says, wait, language of the Ketubin and Dichrin of Yerusha can't really bother Rabbi Natan in making him think that it's like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, because there's not just Ketubin and Dichrin, there's Ketuba Benot Nukvan. Okay, Benot Nukvan is Benot Nekevot, female daughters. It's funny they say male children, right? Male boys, Banim itself is masculine and Banot is feminine, but they say it anyway. Now, just to be clear, right? Banim could include girls, Banot couldn't include boys, but once they have Banim Dichrin, the parallel was Benot Nukvan. Now, what's this? This is a different principle that comes in this ketuba, and we don't yet know how this is connected, but in a minute we'll get there. Ditna. Another Mishnah says that, and this is also, maybe it's even in the same, I think it's in the same Mishnah. Lo katavla binan nukvan dehavia. Actually, it says binan. It doesn't say banot. Okay, binan nukvan, which are banot nekevot. Okay, female children. Diahavim lechiminai. That we will birth together, right? You will have children with me. Yehavim yatvan bebeiti. They will live in my house. V'yitzana minechsai, and will get mizonot from my money. Ad tilakachlan legufran, until they get married. That's a stipulation. He promises the girls, and we're going to see later that it's only at time of death, which is a strange thing. Okay. And when they're born, until they're age 6, he has to give them sustenance. That's a basic, right that they have to get sustenance. From age 6, they actually don't. But the ketuba promises, if I die and they're over the age of 6, okay, until they get married, from age 6 until they get married, okay, until age 6 anyway, I have to, from age 6 until they get married, if I die, my estate will support these girls. They'll be able to stay in my house and they'll get food. What about when he's still alive? Okay, that's a whole question. Came up in the Gemara. We talked about this before, or in the commentaries. I can't remember now if it's clear in the Gemara, if it's just the commentaries. There's actually a whole thing that if he's rich, they actually force him to, okay, and they even, if he's not, there's things they could do. They could try to push him. There's cases where they could say they beat him up, or they embarrass him and say this man is cruel, he's not feeding his daughters. So it's not so clear cut that, okay, from age 6 and up, the girls are on their own until he dies, and only then do they get food because of this ketuba, because of the promise of the ketuba. But really, there's other ways the rabbis use to try to force this man to feed his daughters. Okay, we don't try to let them on the street without the father, without trying to force the father in all ways that we can to try to get him to feed the daughters. So that's just an aside, just so you don't worry that they're just leaving the girls out to fend for themselves. But What's the point here? Well, in the same document, you have the ketuba and dichrin, which says you're going to inherit, right? My male children will inherit. And then it says, and the girls will get mizonot and a place to live. Now, so the Mishnah there was just saying if you didn't write this into your ketuba, they would have the rights to demand food in the event the father died and they weren't yet remarried. They weren't yet married. Shutnai beitin. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, this proves that the Mishnah is according to everybody. And back to Rav Pappa's question, even if you say that Yirtun kind of sounds like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, it actually doesn't in this Mishnah. Why? Because we have Lezeb Yerusha, Lezeb Matana, and Kol Lezeb Yerusha Vezel Matana Filu Rabbanan Modu. Remember the sugya we learned? If you say in the same breath, the Toch Kedei Dibur, you say or write both, I'm giving in Yerusha and I'm giving as a gift. We say that everything, right? The whole thing is viewed as a gift. And even the rabbis who don't think you can favor one son over the other would agree that you can in this case because it's a matana. And if you have the benin dichrin together with the benot nukvan, which you do, then it's lezeb Yerusha and lezeb matana. And even the rabbis would agree. So while Abaye tried to say to Rav Pappa, no, I can explain why Rebbe had to change it to Yispun. Now Abaye himself doesn't really understand why Rebbe had to change it to Yispun. Okay, so they each kind of give different reasons. Rav Pappa says it's because it's a Tanai Beitin and that overrides any halacha, even if the rabbis would agree. And Abaye says, well, it's a case of Lezeb Matana and Lezeb Yerusha. However, what we're now going to have is a back and forth that in the end is going to really, we'll see where it goes, but we're going to try to say, we're going to basically say, Lezeb Matana Lezeb Yerusha doesn't really work. Okay? We still might be left with the Tanai Beitin answer of Rav Pappa, but we're going to reject this rejection that Abaye rejected his own answer. We're going to reject his rejection. That's why it's very confusing because there's a rejection of the rejection. Okay? We're going to be left with that Rav Pappa basically says it's Tanai Beitin, and Abaye says in response, Rebbe still needed to say Yispun because it sounded like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. Now, that's why I'm just telling you where we're going to end so you don't get confused in the process. Because this is all a parenthetical thing because we're going to, Abaye then tries to answer his own, and reject his own answer, but we're going to have a response to that. Okay? Because in the end, we're going to say the Benot Nukvan and the Benin Zcharim weren't really put in the ketuba at the same time historically. And the Benin Dichrin went in first by itself, and it was just Yerusha. Okay? And that would explain why he would then, right, you can't put these together. That's in the end where we're going. And therefore, the commentaries are split in the end about how to read the sugya and the conclusion of the sugya. Do we go with Rav Pappa that really, it goes like the rabbis, and then this doesn't teach you anything about Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka saying about a bari? Or do we say in the end, like Abaye, that it's Yirtun, right? And it sounds like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, and that's why in the end it is Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, and it's even Bibari. Okay, so it's just unclear where the conclusion is in the end. So the Gemara now says that Amarle, we have a different person who comes along. So Abaye rejected his own rejection of of what Rav Pappa said. He now rejects what he suggests, his answer or response to Rav Pappa. But these other rabbis are going to try to bring it back and say, no, what you just said about Lezeb Yerusha, Lezeb Matana isn't true. Amalei Rav Nechumi v'ita Amar Rav Chananya bar Yomi. One of them said it, not clear who. La Abaye. Sorry. I don't know if they say, I guess they said it to Abaye directly. Now moving to Amud Bet. Mimai debachad beidin itkun. Why do you assume that the Benin Zcharim and the Benot Nikevot were all instituted by the same court at the same time? Dilma betray beidin itkun. Maybe it was instituted by two different Betei Din, 2 different times, and therefore the Benin Dichrim, which was in the language of Yerusha, would show, right, Yirtun, it sounds like Yerusha, and you're choosing sons over the other, and that would then reinstate Abaye's response to Rav Pappa. To which the Gemara tries to reject this, but will be unsuccessful. Lo salkadatach de katani reisha. Well, right now we think we can reject this because in a different Mishnah, which came just before this one, I don't know if it's the one just before or a few before, but in Ketubot Mem Tet, we were in Nun Bet. Ketubot Mem Tet, it brings a Mishnah that says the following. Zemidrash darash Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah lefnei chachamim b'kerem b'yavne. Okay, he brought this drasha before the rabbis in kerem b'yavne, which is the way they describe the Sanhedrin in Yavne. It's like a kerem with rows, like a vineyard. Habanim yirshu v'habanot yizon. They make what we call in Torah law. We talk about psukim in the Torah. We call this a hekesh. Here also we're going to call it. It's like a hekesh. We compare one to the other. We say ma banim, and this is something I told you we get to, but I kind of said it as a fact, but as if they didn't know this before. Ma banim enam yorshim ela lachar mitata bihem. Just like the sons don't inherit because that's what inheritance is until after the father dies. Af banot lo yizonu ela lachar mitata bihem. Likewise, this stipulation, the ketuba, is only giving rights to the daughters to get mizonot after the father's death. So now, why is this relevant? Well, if we say the whole thing was instituted in one court at one time, we can understand why they would learn one from the other. But if you say this was instituted in two different courts at two different times, which is what they were suggesting, how could you learn one from the other? That's not such a difficult question. That's an easy question to answer because you could say, Mimai, why are you assuming it was at the same time just because they learn one from the other? Remember, if it's at the same time, then again, you were back to saying, why did Rebbe have to change the language from Yirtun to Yisbun? It basically, it was language of Yerusha and Matana together, and that would fit like Chachamim very easily. But now we're going to reject that. It's not true. Because Dilma Lavalam Emalach Betrei Beidina Itkun, it could be it was instituted at different times in two different courts. Ubeidina Batra Tikun Kebeidina Kama. First, they put in the Ketubin in Dichrin. Then, at a later time in a different court, they instituted the Benot Nukvan. And when they did that, they said, oh, you know what? We'll institute this to be parallel to that. Meaning, just like that one's only after death, this one will also only be after death. So you won't start saying, oh, well, if this one's during the life, maybe that will be during the life. Or this one, right? You wouldn't. They agreed to just they decided to just institute one like the other. So where does this leave us? This leaves us rejecting Abaye's rejection of his own answer, which leaves us again, as I said in the end, we have Rav Pappa, who suggests that there's no reason to assume that this braita proves that the Mishnah is like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, and Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka said his words even bebari, because maybe this is a Tanai Beit Din and has nothing to do with it, It overrides basic laws, and even the rabbis would agree with it because it's a special takana here. Abaye then, who said, no, it's because of the language of Yerusha, and because the language of Yerusha, that's why Rebbe wanted to change. And again, it's just a semantic argument about why did Rebbe change the language, because remember, Rebbe changes the language back. Okay, right? He says, oh, forget my change. It doesn't make sense. But they're questioning that one line. So because they're questioning that one line, again, I'm just getting into the area of murky waters. It's not clear if they're having a question just about that middle line and the thing and having nothing to do with the conclusion. Or in the end, the content of what they're saying, though, could really contradict the conclusion of the previous sugya. And some of them are take that approach, and some of them say, no, it's just an argument about that one line in the middle there and just semantics. But some people say, no. But the conclusion is, at least according to Rav Pappa, Tanai Beitin, which then would override. On the other hand, the bias says, no, it still uses the language of Yerusha, which sounds like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. It could be Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. So there's a bit of a lack of clarity about what the conclusion of this sugya is, which is a big issue, because since we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, does that mean we paskin like him even if a bari says it, or not, only if it was said on someone's deathbed? Okay, there's more like lack of clarity about some other things that the commentaries go off on, which I didn't get into, like if you wrote it, would it be different than if you said it? And maybe the question is, if you say it as a bari, is that going to work? Of course, if you write it, it will work. The question is really, what if you say it and you didn't write it? It's another, again, this is getting a little off, but just to point out that there's a lot of lack of clarity in the sugya about what this means practically. Now we're going to go to our second and last sugya of today. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. And there's a lot of lack of clarity about this also and how this relates to Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka's approach. Shmuel rules here, I'm quoted by Rabbi Yehuda, Hakotev kol nechasav liishto lo asaha ela bitropa. If somebody promises all of his possessions to his wife, he didn't, okay, and he writes it. He didn't really mean it. What did he mean? He meant she's going to be the steward, the apitropos of the trust. She's going to decide how to invest the money, how to give it out to the sons, when, okay? That's up to her to do. And that's what he meant when he gave her all of his property. This is a very strange halacha. What do you mean? The husband writes, I'm giving you all my property, and we don't understand it that way. So why don't we understand it that way? Well, this is what we call an umdan da'at with an aleph. Le'emod is to assess. And this we do all the time in halacha. We assess, what do we think this person really meant? Now, usually we do it in a case where there's a lack of clarity. This actually doesn't really have a lack of clarity. This person said, I want to give all my property to my wife. So why would we come in and say he meant to make her a steward? The assumption is that if he had sons or heirs who should have gotten it, he didn't really mean to give all of his possessions to his wife, even though nowadays that's what most people do, right? But what he meant is, and the truth is, there's a little bit of debate. The Rashbam says here we mean in a matana. He gave it to her as a gift. But without getting into too many details about the relevance of that. But the assumption is he wouldn't write his sons out of his will. So he must have just meant that what he meant was, I want you to respect the wife. In other words, I want you to respect your mother, and I want her to be in charge. And he was worried that they wouldn't have respect for her enough. So he put it in writing that everything is hers, which really just means everything is in her charge, but it doesn't mean she actually owns it all. Now, some people, so the question is, and we're going to see, this is going to be the same thing if he does it to one of the sons. Now, what about Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka, who says if you write it to one of the sons, right? So now, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka never said right. So again, there's a big deliberation in the commentaries how to relate with this sugya, how to connect it to Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. So I'll just go with one approach, which is here it's written and there it was said. And the assumption is if you say it, you might be actually meaning you want to give it all to one son. But if you write it, because you bothered to write it down, you wanted to show something more. Now, again, it's hard for us to believe because we always write wills down. But in those days, they didn't write as much everything. Because you wrote it, what you really meant was, I want it in writing because I want to make sure that you accord her the proper respect that she deserves. And I want you to, and why is it this concern they're not going to trust her? Well, like anytime there's a will and there's a deliberation about what to do with the money and how are we investing it and when are we dividing it and all of that, you could imagine that debates would ensue. And he wanted them to know there's one person in charge and this is the person in charge. And that's what he was trying to say. And you have to have respect for them. And that's why he bothered to write it down. So there's a difference between, because he bothered to write it down, it actually ends up meaning something else. Now, if you're confused by this because you say, but he said, I'm writing all my possessions to her. And he wrote it down as if like, some people say if he actually did a kinyan, it would be different. A kinyan, like picked up a handkerchief, it actually means he'd be passing this all on to her. And this is only without a kinyan. It really confused a lot of people. And as far as to say, when we get to Daf Kuf Mem Dalet, so in about 2 weeks' time, we're going to get to a place where they say there's 3 things that are called a hilchata belo tama. There's 3 times where we rule a particular way, even though it's totally not logical. And this is one of them, okay? Because this is really not logical. To say that somebody said something and we're going to take it and say he really didn't mean what he said based on what we know of behavioral patterns of other people, but he said it explicitly, and how could we right and basically understand him in some other way? So they call this hilchata belo tama. Now, it doesn't mean we don't hold this way. Hilchata belo tama means there's certain cases where we hold like people, even though it's not logical. Now, there's a deliberation there. It doesn't mean it's not logical. It doesn't mean it's just harder to see the logic, and you might not understand it, but there is a logic, and it makes a lot of sense. But, some people might think it doesn't make sense. Or maybe it really doesn't make sense, but we have a tradition about it. That's a whole issue in and of itself. Maybe we'll discuss it when we get to there. But if you're confused by it, so were other people, as we're going to see. So now the Gemara is going to say, Pshita beno gadol lo asa el apitropos. What if he wrote all of his nechasim? And this is where it clearly seems to go against Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka. Even if he wrote all, and that's why, again, the commentaries have to differentiate between the cases, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Obviously, if it was his oldest son, it makes sense that he would be making him an apitropos. Now, some of the commentaries connect this with kibud avaim and kibud, older brother, right? They say the ed includes your older brother. And when it's people who it's obvious you're supposed to afford respect to, the father is, now you would say maybe the opposite, right? But it was the mitzvah to afford respect. The father wanted to ensure that that mitzvah was kept. So he basically said, I'm giving them all my property so that the younger siblings would respect the older brother, or the siblings would all respect the mother. But beno katan man. But what about a beno katan who doesn't need to get respect, right? There's no mitzvah to respect the younger brother. And also, would it be likely the father would make the younger brother the steward? Now, here it's a little bit ironic, because if he's not the steward, the apitropos, then it means that the father couldn't have meant to make him the apitropos, and then the father's actually giving him all the possessions, which leads to the question, why would he give him all the possessions? But anyway, we didn't know why ben Abanit. So we don't know about the Benoah Katan. But Itmar, we do know actually, because it was said that Rav Chanilai bar Idi Amar Shmuel was also passed down the name of Shmuel, but by somebody else. Afilu Benoah Katan mutal ba'arisa. Okay, even if there's no logic to it, even if the father said, this baby who's in their carriage right now and is really a baby is going to get all my possessions, what he really meant was he's going to be the steward when I die, he's in charge. It's a little bit extreme, but that's what he rules. Pshita. Now they say again, obvious, benova acher b'matana, beno apitropos. There's different ways to understand this. I'll go with the interpretation that we're talking about. A father gave half of his possessions to his son and half to somebody else. Acher b'matana, the other person gets it as a gift, and it's all going to be given to him. But the brother, beno apitropos. Okay, since we said, if you're giving all your property to one son over the others, and here you took your property, you split it 50-50, we're going to look at what we call pagina dibure. We split your thing in half entirely. What you said about the other person, obviously you wouldn't make another person the apitropos of your son's property. Now, this is funny. Nowadays, people do that. But the assumption is if you're giving them half the property, what you really meant is, I'm giving that to you as a gift. But the part to the son, we assume meant, I'm giving it to you to be a steward. Okay, you're going to be in charge for the other brothers. So not that he was writing out all the other sons out of the will. He was just saying this one, the rest of my possessions are going to be divided by all the sons, and you're the one in charge. Ishto arusa v'ishto grusha b'matana. If you have a woman, though, who he's not married to yet, he's only betrothed to her, or he divorced her already, and yet he says he's giving her all of his property. Okay, now this is, again, a little bit ironic. Because he has less of a connection to them, okay, because they're not married. Either they weren't ever married yet, they were only betrothed, or they were married but now divorced. He doesn't have this need for her to get respect from other people. So therefore, if it doesn't mean respect, and he wrote her all of his property, he must have actually been giving her all of his property. It's ironic, because why would he be giving her all his property, right? There's this assumption, though, that if you care about someone more, what you're doing is you're making them apitropos because you're giving them a place of respect. This is a very hard sugya to understand, and I think it's really hard to understand because we don't live in their times. And I think this is one of those sugyot where if you're talking about what do people mean by what they say, it's very important to be in context and to understand the different relationships between people and how people perceive people. And it's very hard to understand this with we read it through our eyes and the society that we live in. So now they ask the following question. Ba etzel habanim. What if it's a daughter among brothers? Does it mean he wants the daughter to be respected by the brothers? Or is that something that in general, right? It's not like there's a halacha, kabed avicha bet imecha, kabed your older brother. There's no halacha to have respect for the daughters in place of the sons. So maybe it means, again, that he's giving all his possessions to her. Or maybe he does want her to be in charge and he wants them to respect her. What if he has no sons and no daughters and he just has brothers who are going to inherit him? So what if he gives it to the wife in that case? Is it to say, I want my brothers to respect my wife? Which again, there's no real commandment to do that, so maybe that's not what he wants. The sha'etzel b'nei haba, a woman by the sons of his sons, which again are not commanded to respect her. She's not their mother. Okay, he has sons from a different marriage, mahu. So Amar Ravina, we're now going to have two opinions about this, and this will end. Amar Ravina mishmei Rava, bikulu lo kana levar ishto arusa ushto grusha. All these cases, we assume he's trying to tell everybody else, and that's why he's writing it down, that I want you to respect this person. They're going to be the executor of my will, okay, of my money. They're going to decide what to do with it. even a mother, right, or the mother among her people who are not her children, or the daughter among the brothers. Okay? And therefore, they don't get all the possessions, but they are in charge. Rav Pappa, and the only ones of these Grusha, where there's no reason to afford them respect because he doesn't have that close connection with her. Whereas with his daughters, with his wife, who he's married to, he has very close connection, would want to kind of raise her up and make sure she's respected properly. Rav Avira, Mishmei Rava, draws the line differently. Amar Bekulu Kane. Actually, in all the cases, Kane, except for which ones? Me'isha etzel achim v'isha etzel b'nei abal. Okay, we assume he means also the isha, right? So what he means is the isha rusan, the isha grusha are kone, and the bat etzel abanim also. He differs with the previous opinion on that one issue. Bat ben abanim, actually she inherits everything. But with the wife, with the brothers, there would be an issue for him to want her to get the respect, and the wife etzel b'nei abal. This seems to be saying that a wife who is married, a woman who he's married to, he always wants to afford her respect. Not necessarily true for a daughter, and not true for a wife who is betrothed to, and not true for a wife who he divorced. So with that, we finished today's daf. We had a lot of different cases here. So we started with the question of this basic question, which we got all off on some confusing sugyot about when Rabbi Yochanan Ben Broka said what he said in a shchid meirah, did he mean it's true also for someone who's healthy? Can they, in the language of Yerusha, choose one son over other sons? Then we said basically, yes, he does say it. But then there was a deliberation, and it wasn't so clear between Rav Pappa and Abaye about whether maybe the sugya could be explained according to the rabbis as well, and that it wouldn't prove anything. And then we had this question about someone who writes all of his nechasim. Could it be understood that he had a different motive and a different agenda, an agenda to provide respect? And then the question was, to who would it make sense, and to who wouldn't it make sense? And there were some different opinions back and forth about this. And with this, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, a good week, a good month, and Chodesh Tov and B'sorot Tovot.